Good evening, and welcome to the Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from the middle of America, FEMA Region 5. Today is May 11th, 2017, and I'd like to focus on foreign policy, the events in Europe, because Marine Le Pen has lost the election to Emmanuel Macron, what he was called the centrist candidate, and the media consistently called Marine Le Pen the far-right extremist candidate. Now, I really think that's an unfair evaluation on both accounts because Marine Le Pen is a nationalist, and I don't see nationalism as being far right. And Emmanuel Macron, who's called a centrist, actually worked with the socialist government of France, of Hollande. He was never elected. He was appointed briefly to a position in the government, but this was a socialist government. And he's never been called a socialist. He's very wealthy. He was a banker with the Rothschild cartel and has made himself an enormous fortune, very, very wealthy. He certainly doesn't act like a socialist. He also was recently found out and discovered to have an offshore bank account in the Caymans. Now, Marine Le Pen, in the debate, accused him of having an offshore bank account to avoid the very high French taxes, which is illegal, in the Caribbean, and he said no. And it turned out no. Well, actually, he did have one, but it was in the Caymans, and so it's a little bit different. And so he was trying to avoid being found out, and he got found out. Well, there was also a hack of a lot of emails, and yet these have to be gone through and discovered to find if there are any problems that he might have. As far as I know, nothing yet, but these are like 10, 20, 30,000 emails. Now, what will happen with Macron? What is the projection? What does the prognostication look like in the various opinions about what the future will show for France? So I have about a 20-minute segment from Nigel Farage's radio show. It's also televised. And Nigel Farage is always interesting, always very clear in his thinking. He's entertaining. He's well worth a look. Now, Nigel Farage is a former leader of the UKIP party, United Kingdom Independence Party. And he still is, what's called an MEP. He's a member of the European Parliament in Brussels, which is sort of a show parliament, really. They don't have very much power at all. It's really not the European Parliament that makes the decisions in the European Union. They are basically a rubber stamp. But he used the European Parliament to be the opposition figure, and he joined the European Parliament, left a very lucrative job to attempt to find a way to get the United Kingdom out of the European Union. And of course, as you probably know if you've been following this, he has more or less succeeded. The referendum was held in the United Kingdom, and the vote was to leave. And this is the famous Brexit. Now, and Marine Le Pen wanted also to get out of the European Union, and so this has been delayed. But a lot of the commentators are saying that this is only temporary, that eventually France will leave the European Union. Well, as we can imagine, France is a very important part of the European Union, and if it leaves, this will spell the doom of the European Union. And as Nigel Farage mentions, the goal of the European Union is the United States of Europe. So it would be a similar situation that we have in the United States, except in a way quite different, though, because Europe is made up of traditional countries that have each country has a much more well-defined culture than the United States. We are not so, our states are not so so well-defined as countries. They never were countries. They never were independent countries. However, the way the United States is set up, the state governments actually have more power than the individual countries have under the control of the European Union. Because in the United States, at least we have a federal government that has genuine representatives with power that can control the agenda. Whereas in the European Union, the European Council makes the decisions. They're unelected. So the European people, the people who live in the member states of the European Union really are very much lacking power. And like a typical tyrannical state starts out, they feed the people good programs. They help the people. They try to gain the confidence of the people by giving them things. And this is the way the European Union started out. So you lull people into the sense that this is a beneficent tyranny, and it's a good thing. But always, 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 if you look at history, it always turns against the people. And this is absolutely inevitable. There's no other way that this could turn out any differently because of the way tyranny works. And you can refer to the famous quote, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." And there's a reason for that, though. It's because they need to crack down on dissidents or else they will be knocked out. Because there will always be people who don't like the status quo, who want to change, who want something different, or who want to knock you off and your pedestal, your power, take away your power and get that power for themselves. I'm also showing two other clips. One is an Alex Jones clip, which I thought was pretty informative. It's about our United States relationship with China, the differences in the currency, and how it is unfair the way the free market works. He tries to explain that. I think he does a pretty good job. It's about 5 minutes. And then there's an even shorter clip, only about 3 minutes, in which a gentleman who I've never heard of before, named Jordan Peterson, tries to explain how Donald Trump is probably not a moron or insane. So let's look at those clips, and then we'll get back and I'll talk more about how things are going in the world.
If China has a corporate tax, depending on which year it is, it changes 10 to 15 points lower than ours. And if China has a currency 30 to 40 points below ours, depending on, again, what day of the week it is, but 30 to 40 points lower than ours. And if they have no environmental standards and slave labor wages and 16 to 18-hour work days with no benefits, how do we compete with that? Now, the mainline libertarian think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation and others, that claim they're conservative, claim they're libertarian, they'll tell you, oh, well, free trade just means we're totally wide open and we don't care what you do. You can have 100% tariff on us, we've got 0 on you. And then they don't complain when we have our coal power plants shut down, which gives us cheap electricity, and then China builds new ones. They don't point out that it's totally rigged at a 90-degree angle against us. Totally.
If somebody wants to build a coal power plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted.
We're going to put a lot of coal miners and coal companies out of business.
And Coal Resource Director
Zhao Yu Wei doesn't think this will affect China. He says the shipping distance compared with Indonesia, Australia, and other traditional thermal coal exporters is too far, so it should not have a direct impact on the Chinese market in the short term.
The historical problem with the coal industry is when we have these pairings back, there's nothing there to replace it. Coal's the only industry in this region. It's not the regulation so much as it is the execution of it. When you come in and you tell this many people that your industry is gone, we have to have someplace to go.
Coal is a leading source of carbon dioxide emissions, and even though Minnesota's already cut carbon emissions by 20%, new federal pollution standards require the state to cut more, 40% by 2030.
Minnesota is being punished because we took this action without the federal government telling us. So whatever that percentage is, reasonable people can disagree about it, but why would we support a policy that punishes the state of Minnesota for acting on our own?
Richard Nixon was the progenitor of the EPA, and the basic rules were established then. And those basic rules are, it's an administrative agency. It's not in the executive branch, it's not in the legislative branch, it's not in the judicial branch, and the president gets to appoint his people to it. And they get to write the regulations that regulate the behavior of corporations and private individuals. And those regulations stand unless disturbed by the courts or by both houses of Congress.
This is going to shut down about 1/10 of our capacity. And as the journal pointed out, if a terrorist were to shut down 1/10 of our coal-generating capacity, it would be an act of war.
And it's done by design. If Trump lowers our corporate tax to the global average, he's only made us on a level playing field. If he goes 5 points below, which he's pushing for, you could argue it's a trade war. So what? We've been getting the short end of the stick for 50 years.
The money that's outside of this country, nobody knows how much. They think it's $2.5 trillion. I think it's probably more than that, but nobody knows. That money, Aaron's going to come back into the country, and it's going to stay here, and they're going to invest it here. And frankly, from now on, when these companies make money outside of the country, they can bring it back in at a reasonable tax. The reason it stays there is the tax is so onerous, as you know. It's a massive tax.
The media's been telling us how to dress and what to eat and what to do and how to talk for 50, 60 years. We've had enough of it.
Part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Oh, the Chinese might have a trade war. Do it. We're already under a trade war. What do you think? 80% of our factories closing and our mining disappearing and rare earth minerals. The U.S. has less than 1% of global rare earth mineral extraction. 30 years ago, we had more than half. We're under economic sabotage.
What would you say Trump's IQ really is? Does 160 seem reasonable?
No.
This will be quoted in...
No, 160 is really, really high.
Yeah.
I mean, the typical... The smart person that you're likely to meet in your life has an IQ of around 145.
Yeah.
160 is getting pretty damn rare. And Trump's old, and IQ goes down with age, fluid IQ, although crystallized IQ either stays the same or goes up slightly. So he isn't the problem solver or the learner that he was when he was 20. No one is. If you're in good physical shape, that helps a lot. His IQ is clearly well above average. I don't know. And he's done complex things in his life, and a lot of them. And that indicates that there's something to him, you know, and he hasn't been successful just in one domain. He's been successful in multiple complex domains, each of which were quite difficult. It's very difficult to be a reality TV star that's successful, right? It's very difficult to work in the construction business, and especially on large projects. And I know he's had his economic ups and downs, but he stayed in the game for a long time, very stressful. He's very stress resistant. So he's no dummy. I mean, it's nice to always think that your political opponent is just stupid, but he's done too many complex things for me to assume that he's somehow, if he wasn't smart, he couldn't have done those things.
Yeah, I'm glad you're acknowledging that, because when I see the people that are in hysteric mode and just saying he's this evil nutbag who doesn't know what he's doing and all this stuff, it just seems like such a lazy way of thinking about it. You don't have to like any of the things. You may not like the way he speaks or any of that, but the idea that somehow this is a dumb person, I think, is discounting of just the way humans have to work. This is interesting from Super Chat. Do you have any...
he also won the presidency.
Right.
With a completely original campaign. And it's like, and without spending much money. It's like, okay, is he lucky? Because is that what you're saying? It's just lucky.
Right.
Well, I don't think it was just luck. It was at least maybe, well, it looked at least to some degree like courage. Maybe it was just blind, throwing caution to the wind. You know, I don't know if he ever expected that he could possibly win.
Yeah, and as I'm sure you'd argue, it probably had a little something to do with all those things, that maybe there was some courage, but that he also surrounded himself with people who maybe understood politics more than he did.
Well, he can also obviously read a crowd.
Yeah.
Because he was appealing to crowds. And that was partly because he did, I think, try to say what he thought. Now, you could criticize what he thought, and that's fine. But he also didn't prepare the same speech. You know, he didn't prepare a speech and then deliver the same one everywhere, which I think is, I really find that rather reprehensible for people to do that.
Yeah.
Because they're parroting themselves, or someone else writes their speeches, which is something I can't even imagine.
I can't. For what we do, I can't even fathom it. Actually, I think this.
Thank you, Donald. Well, like Donald Trump, a major Western country has elected a leader who has never held elected office at any point in his life. In fact, he'd never stood before. Emmanuel Macron, who, after a very successful education, made a lot of money with Rothschilds in the banking sector, was appointed briefly as finance minister in Hollande's socialist government, but a year ago set up his own brand new political movement, I think as much as anything else because the Socialist Party in France had collapsed. And yesterday he got 66% of the vote and Marine Le Pen got about 34% of the vote. So it was a big win for Macron, a 2-1 win. Not a particular surprise. I think some people thought Le Pen might get a few pips higher than that. We might examine why that wasn't the case. But what I thought was astonishing, indeed audacious, was that his first act, having been elected as the new president, the 8th president of the 5th Republic of France, was as he walked up to give his victory speech, this is the music that we heard.
You have chosen audacity, and this audacity, we will pursue it, and every single day to come, we will carry on being audacious, because that is what French men and women are expecting, because after all, that is what Europe and the world are expecting from us.
Vive la République! Vive la France! Well, it certainly was audacious, very audacious, when you've just been elected the president of your country to walk up and give your speech to the anthem of a different country. Now, we knew that Macron was pro-European Union. We knew that he was a globalist. I would wager there'll be a lot of people in France really, really shocked that he chose that piece of music before he gave his opening address as the president-elect. I must say, I was very, very surprised indeed. But whilst he is pro-EU, he is, as we've seen with pro-EU leaders in Britain, making an argument for reform. This is Macron last night.
I'm a pro-European. I defended constantly during this election the European idea and European policies and so on, because I do believe it's extremely important for French people and for the place of our country in globalization. The question is that you have almost half of this country angry with the European idea and with a lack of satisfaction vis-à-vis what we decided 10 years ago and during the recent years. So we have to reform this Europe. We need a new European Union in situation to protect our people and to regulate our globalization.
Well, there's Macron. He's talking about change. Not so much change in France's relationship with the European Union, but fundamental change within the European Union itself. We will look at that. We will examine that. But given the scale of his victory, does President Emmanuel Macron mean that the future of the European Union is now secure? And if you think yes, absolutely, Macron is the EU saviour, then call us on 0345 6060 973. If you think actually the whole thing's completely unreformable and there's very little one man can do, then of course you can text at 84850. If you think actually the whole thing's doomed anyway, it doesn't make any difference, then using the hashtag Farage and LBC, you can tweet as LBC. And don't forget, you can watch us live on LBC's Facebook page right now. And just to give some sort of reminder of what happened yesterday, Macron got just over 18 million votes. Le Pen got just over 11 million votes. 10 million people did not go out to vote, but astonishingly, 4 million people who went to vote either despoiled their paper by writing something very rude on the paper, or by tearing it up, or by leaving the paper blank and put it back in the box. 12% of people spoiled their papers. Now that is astonishing. I suspect some of them were hard leftists who see Macron as a big banker and couldn't possibly bring themselves to vote for him or Le Pen. And indeed, many of them have been out protesting, or some might say rioting, on the streets of Paris today. But I also think there were a large number of people who in the first round had voted for Eurosceptic candidates, particularly Mélenchon, who is the hard left-winger who basically wants France to leave the European Union, who simply couldn't bring themselves to vote for Le Pen. Either way, it's remarkable that 4 million people made the effort to go to the polling station and to spoil their papers. So is the EU saved with President Macron? I'm going to ask Phil in Cobham that very question. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Nigel. Well, of course, it's far too early to say whether the EU's saved and by one person. Of course not.
Sure.
I mean, one thing is, as far as I'm concerned, the collaboration, a union of Europe is the future, whether you like it or not. I mean, I think this is ridiculous in this day and age. I mean, we're seeing such enormous political changes going on, in geopolitical changes in the world. And, we're in risk of losing our Western culture if we're not careful. I mean, I think, the vision, since we've been in the European Union, we've never been committed at all to the vision of what it's all about.
Well, the vision, Phil, the vision is very simple. It's a United States of Europe, with its own army, its own foreign policy, its own currency, its own government. I mean, that's the vision, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I don't see the problem with that. I mean, you're going to pull away. We're now going to pull away, a tiny little nation with less than 1% of the world's population. You think you're going to be able to easily and freely?
Why are you talking us down, Phil? Why are you being so negative about us?
What?
Why are you being so negative
I'm
about
not.
us?
I'm just because the world is changing, Nigel.
You're right, Phil. Do you know what's happening, Phil? All over the world, and this has now been going on ever since 1945 continually, all over the world, what is happening is big states and big structures are breaking down into smaller individual structures. Every single year that goes by, we get more nations in the world. We can think of the breakup of much of the old USSR. We can think of Yugoslavia, which was put together with the aim to bring peace, which is broken down into smaller units and may break down into smaller ones too. Phil, the point I'm making actually is that in the modern world, people are not aggregating in big blocks, they're breaking into smaller ones.
Look, Nigel, whether you like it or not, the future it's within the internet, it's within travel, it's within communication. The world is getting smaller, but there are very great cultural differences within blocks, regions in the world. Now, we risk losing our influence and our projection, if you like, within the world because we are withdrawing.
Well, Phil, I couldn't take a more contrary view to you. I think actually the more you're part of the European Union, the more you lose your voice on the world stage. Already Britain doesn't have a voice in world trade. There are plans within the European Union for example, on the UN Security Council, the individual member countries, France, Britain, to be replaced by one EU representative. And I think, actually, we're going to have a bigger voice in the world. But, Phil, the real question wasn't so much about us. It was about France. Phil, you've made your argument very well. I thank you. Phil thinks the EU is the future. I happen to say I don't particularly agree, but maybe you agree with Phil. If you do, let me know. What does Ranjit in Birmingham think? Will President Macron effectively kill off Euroscepticism in France and be good for the European project?
Well, indirectly, he may be the savior of the union, but I think the real person who's saved the union has been the election of Donald Trump.
Do you?
Because I think because he's so fickle and he never sticks to what he says.
You think he's sorry, Ranjit? You think the 45th president of the USA is thick? Yeah.
No, fickle.
Fickle. Sorry, I misheard you. Right, fickle. No. Okay, go on. Yeah.
And so it's made the EU very insecure, whereas with a pro-free trade and a pro-NATO president, it made the EU feel secure, made me feel secure enough to vote to leave. And so with an anti-free trade president in the United States who complains about surpluses from Mexico, and guess who's got a bigger surplus than Mexico with the United States? Us. And so he's been telling his trade negotiators to. He actually told his trade negotiator at the G7 to remove a communique, a regular communique that the G7 had to free trade and the removal of tariffs. And at the behest of the Americans, they removed that communique. So now the EU feels unsafe. So it's going to pull together to try and defend itself against the Russians and other threats.
We'll
and it
see.
feels unsafe economically because it feels if they want to trade freely, then the United States is not a reliable partner in establishing free trade around the world.
I think actually, Ranjit, there are different messages coming from the Trump regime on free trade. I mean, for example, the message loudly and clearly that Britain could be at the front of the queue, the message that Germany was benefiting from an undervalued euro, the message that China actually was the villain in this, and yet he appears to have formed quite a good relationship with the Chinese, particularly apropos North Korea. I think it's as yet unsure, Ranjit, despite Trump's instincts, exactly what he will do, but I get the perspective. On Twitter, I get the European Union is the future. UK Brexit will be a big failure because of UK isolationism, and that's what Christian tells me. And on Twitter, I support France's democratic decision to choose Macron. He has a big job to take on. Best of luck, France. Well, do you know what? He does have a big job to take on because it would appear there was a great big wave of optimism in Paris last night. And the image that the young of France have gone for, Macron, this big youthful image. Think about this. 80% of the over 65s voted Macron. Le Pen's biggest support and growing support is in the 18 to 24-year-olds and those indeed going up to the age of 40. Actually, generationally, the European project in the rest of Europe is in trouble. The only country in which the youngsters appear to be overwhelmingly in favour of EU membership is the United Kingdom. Fascinating. So don't buy the idea that Macron is about youth and optimism. Actually, it was the pensioners, scared, I think, of what leaving the euro might do to their properties and might do to their pensions. Interesting. Right now, you're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15. It's Macron, 66%. It's Le Pen, 34%. He is going to be the president. So what happens next? Well, he will be sworn in as the French president on the 14th of May. But there's a whole new set of elections to come. So the French, having just voted twice in the last fortnight, will now have to vote twice in the month of June, because what follows the presidential elections are the elections for the French Parliament, the Assemblée Nationale. There are 577 seats. Candidates run, and the top two then go into a runoff a fortnight later. So it's going to be one hell of a battle because, of course, Macron's party, En Marche, which has been rebranded today La République En Marche, don't have any seats in the Assemblée Nationale at the moment, and he needs a working majority to govern. I expect what you're going to see is a deal done with the Socialists and maybe even the Conservatives, and they will do all they can to try and stop Le Pen from getting many seats in the Assemblée Nationale. Of the 577 seats, in the first round of the French presidential election, Le Pen actually topped the poll in 216 of those seats. So a big battle to come in June. And for those of you that are moaning, and I understand why, but you're moaning about the fact we've got yet another election in this country, just think of it, the French will have been asked to vote 4 times in the space of about 11 weeks. Interestingly, I talked about the voting and the number of spoiled papers. The actual turnout was indeed the lowest for 50 years in any French presidential runoff. So that's what happens next. And I wonder, I've talked a little bit about Macron, what happens next to Euroscepticism in France? Bear in mind that in the first round, 46.5% of voters voted Eurosceptic. They voted for Le Pen, they voted for Mélenchon, they voted for Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, and there was one other candidate who got a very small score but was clearly anti-EU. So what was Le Pen's response to losing? Well, initial disappointment, but then a speech, I thought a very interesting speech, a speech saying that she has to make further reform and she has to rebrand the Front National. And I think, quite honestly, if she'd been a candidate that had not been associated with the Front National and was not seen to be in her father's shadow and to be judged by her father, she would have got many more of those Eurosceptic votes yesterday. As it was, she got, let's say nearly 35%, but there's another 10 or 11% who'd registered Euroscepticism in the first round that didn't do it. My guess is she'll do a deal with my friend Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, who's a conservative Eurosceptic. My guess is they will try and get rid of anybody in the Front National who could ever be seen to be linked with political extremism. If they do that and get it right, then I think things would be different. And I do think, actually, that unless Macron succeeds, given the extent to which he's raised expectations, you could see Le Pen making a much bigger run at this in 5 years' time. But maybe the one shadow that is on her horizon and on the Eurosceptics' horizon is her niece, 27-year-old Marion Maréchal Le Pen, young, seemed to be good-looking, very eloquent, and she's made it clear she's not entirely happy with Marine's leadership and may well challenge for the leadership of the Front National. So I suspect there's a lot more family rivalry to come within the Le Pen family over the course of the next few months, weeks, indeed years. But I think for anyone that thinks that this victory by Macron means that the Eurosceptics in France have been killed off, I would say that's rubbish. She got double the score her father got when he reached the last round many years ago. And I think, as I say, if she can rebrand the party, she can take it on to bigger things. That is my view. What does Will in Plymouth think? Has Macron saved the European Union?
Hi, Nigel. Yes, I do think he saved the European Union, but ultimately he wants to appoint a European finance minister, I believe.
Oh, yes.
So I think he's very much going to be speeding up the whole process of European integration. I think he wants France to come even more under the yoke of Brussels. He wants a more close Europe. I think it was summed up very nicely by one of your friends, Aaron Banks' tweet last night, where he said this time it's going to be very nice for France to save the Germans the bullets and the fuel. For sort of taking over France in a way, but I think he has saved the European Union. And I think it's going to deepen European integration between European and France.
But Will, does deeper European integration based in Brussels make the people love the project more or loathe it more?
Loathe it more. I believe the French Euroscepticism, really, from an economic point of view, seems to be rather different from the Euroscepticism from our sort of point of view across the channel. Whereas with us, it's more free trade. Whereas with the French Euroscepticism, it seems to be more about protectionist politics, more about sort of the interests of your own country rather than a more sort of global view. I think it could help the Eurosceptics. I think your prediction of Le Pen maybe having a bit more of a resurgence in 5 years' time, could be an interesting one. But it depends A, how the Eurozone goes, and B, how Macron goes, because I think really he's going to be following much more of the consensus of the Socialist Party that he worked under previously. And if that happens, I really could see an increase in Euroscepticism within France.
Well, I thank you very much for your comments and your call. And interesting, isn't it, that Macron was called a centrist all through the campaign and yet was happy to serve as a minister in a socialist government. I'm not sure, other than the fact that he believes in globalism and he believes in European unionism, difficult to know exactly where on the centre-left spectrum Macron really is. And actually, if you listen to his campaign speeches, they were pretty light on content. So it's going to be interesting. Ted says to me through an SMS, Nigel, I think it shows who is Macron's master, and he plans to visit her ASAP. Well, interesting, Ted. Yes, he did have a 10-minute conversation with Angela Merkel last night, and he's announced he'll be going to Berlin to visit her as quickly as possible. I know what Eurosceptics in France will think. They'll say, as indeed Scott in Greenwich says to me, Macron is an EU puppet. Hollande was loathed by France and was obviously told to stand aside so that their boy could be planted. All that it's done is postpone the collapse of the rotten EU construct. So some will see Macron as being the EU's puppet. Others will link him more directly, I think, to Angela Merkel. Either way, I suppose, to be really objective about this, for the European Union to succeed, France and Germany do need to get along together. Steve in Milton Keynes, has Macron saved the European Union for all time?
No.
Right, go on.
No, not at all. He's
Right.
going to make it worse. Short term it'll be better, long term it'll make it worse. There'll be more unemployment, Nigel. There'll be more terrorist attacks. There'll be more migration. There'll be more, the armed forces will be more stretched. It's going to be a disaster.
He's certainly...
So you know that. You know it.
Well, Steve, I mean, I know that he's a great believer in the free movement of people. He's already today indicated that he thinks sanctions should be taken against Poland unless they go along with migrant quotas.
He's gone to Algeria. He went to Algeria.
I know he did.
To get more people. I mean, can you believe that? Can you believe that?
So, Steve...
This man, they have no idea. That man has got more skeletons in his closet than you have any idea about. We all know what we're talking about. It's all going to come out.
Steve. I've heard this about lots of people, including myself. I mean, do you really believe that there are some serious skeletons in that closet?
Well, listen, Nigel. He's a very good-looking man.
Yes.
Very articulate. Very
Yes.
clever.
Yes.
Very, very wealthy.
Yes.
How many of your friends that you know that half that wealth married their teacher 25 years older than them?
Steve, it takes all sorts to make the world go round, you know. But listen, Steve, I thank you for your call. Andrew on Facebook says, funny how all the Le Pen voters aren't rioting and throwing their dummies out of the pram because it's unfair. They didn't get what they wanted. Well, that certainly, Andrew, is what's happening to the hard left on the streets of Paris today. And incidentally, what did Le Pen do after losing? Well, she phoned Macron to congratulate him. She then, and if you haven't seen it, have a look. In fact, we'll get some clips up on LBC's website. She then danced the night away in a disco. So that's, I guess, in a way, that's how you should lose, isn't it, really? Craig says on Facebook, I'm concerned about the appointment of Macron. Well, he's not been appointed, he's been elected. And the impact he'll have on Brexit negotiations. Well, Craig, you know, we did discuss this last week on this show. I said whether you love her or hate her, actually, Le Pen would have been better for Brexit negotiations than Macron, who's going to club together with Juncker and, as I see it, the bully boys in Brussels. Mind you, it's not just me that sees that. British Prime Minister now stands on the steps of Downing Street and has a go at the Brussels bully boys.
Okay, I'm back. I hope you enjoyed those clips. I thought they were pretty informative. Alex Jones does his usual very passionate delivery and explanation about how the United States needs to reform its relationship with China. And I do think that Trump is addressing this, and he also mentioned the problems with North Korea that are happening and how Trump is talking with China. Now recently, in the last couple of days, believe it or not, Henry Kissinger is still alive, apparently, and recently actually went over to China and talked to those people over there. And then he went over and talked to Trump. Now, Henry Kissinger is in his 90s. I'm not exactly sure. If you see him, I don't even see how that guy keeps going. He doesn't look in very good health. He looks like a blob sitting there. And I've always disliked Henry Kissinger. He has a very checkered past. But I suppose it shows how even someone who is a war criminal and actually a wanted man in several countries can maybe do something good because he has these abilities. And I don't know if this goes toward redeeming himself or not. But it's just amazing to me that Henry Kissinger is actually still involving himself in world affairs and is still apparently respected. So he must have his mental faculties all in one piece. Anyway, I thought it was pretty remarkable that he was on the news again after. I haven't heard about Henry Kissinger in quite a while, but every once in a while you hear about him. He seems to prefer to deal with Republicans more than Democrats. I don't quite understand what it's all about. He doesn't. I don't know what his politics are at this point, or if it's even about politics. So then you saw the little clip of the interview with Jordan Peterson, and I thought he made a pretty good case, and it's very common sense, that Trump is not a moron, insane, or something like that. You saw the clip of Trump trying to explain on the Alex Jones clip about the currency difficulties with China and how we need to make some changes in the financial sector to try to become more competitive in the world. Then the third clip, the longest clip, was my favorite European politician, Nigel Farage, who has actually quit the leadership of the UKIP party and is involved sort of behind the scenes, and he got himself also, his platform is now his radio show. He's taking a cue from, I guess, American radio show hosts who field calls from their listeners and then respond to them. But he's still obviously got his hand in and understands a lot about what's going on. He's had a lot of experience in his many years with the European Parliament, and he's learned how it works. And he has a pretty good handle on how things very well may go. And I thought what was really interesting was when he talked about how the trend really is to separate into smaller countries rather than to aggregate into larger countries since the end of World War II. And he mentioned the break apart of the Soviet Union and also the break apart of Yugoslavia. And these were both socialist states or communist states, and they failed. And these were essentially, like the Soviet Union was essentially an empire, and you had a lot of breakaway countries that are now sovereign states. And there are problems associated with having a sovereign state. But the beauty of a small sovereign state is that people who live there have more control over who runs them, who runs their country, what happens in that country. What we're seeing now in Venezuela is another example of how a top-down, command-and-control socialist state can ruin the economy of a country, and then you see the results. We're seeing almost every day in the news the fighting in the streets, people dying, a lot of people getting hurt, and people are attempting to get rid of the socialist leader, Duterte or whatever his name is, in Venezuela. Chavez, the former leader, died, of course, and he was the one that set up the socialist state in Venezuela. And it seemed to be running very well for quite a while. And I think part of it was that he was running it on oil prices. That's where the source of the income was, and he was able to fund his programs using the oil. Well, when the oil prices collapsed, and they've gone even lower, they're now below $50 a barrel. Like the last I heard was 46. This is a situation where people can hardly, these oil companies can barely afford to get the oil out of the ground because the profit margin that they need to keep going is simply just not there. And I think this is part of what happened in Venezuela. And this is a difficulty with a centrally controlled government that runs the economy, that subsidizes certain industries and ignores others, and makes these decisions that are not based on free market principles, they're not based on capitalism, they're not based on individual initiative. This is really what's required because it allows for diversity, a diverse array of very clever people who are working more or less on their own and able and encouraged even to compete with each other, to create better products, to do things and do work more efficiently, and allowed to get an accumulation of wealth. There are certain people who need to have wealth. I mean, people who come up with an idea should be allowed to accumulate enough wealth to be able to develop that idea and to essentially make themselves be wealthy, and then they can pay their employees. Now, you can say, well, but these people exploit their employees. And very often these people do, because that's the way they're thinking. They are very self-centered. They want to enrich themselves with their idea, with their product, to the greatest extent possible. They're thinking of themselves, their family, their future, their legacy, whatever. And so the tendency is that you want to get the most value for the buck, and one way you can save costs is on labor costs. Keep your labor costs down. Well, unfortunately, this is the mindset of many people. They don't see that people maybe they're not going to get the best quality person if they keep labor costs down, because they're not going to come work for them. They'll try to find someone else. And so competition does come into play. If you want better people, you have to be willing to pay them more. And what sometimes happens, of course, and especially in a monopoly, if you're the only person making that product and there's no competition, then your employees have no other options. They have to work for you. That makes them vulnerable and makes them more easily exploitable. If you have the blessing and the power of the government, a very powerful government behind you, and the military, and the military can be used to support a favored industry in a country, which is very anti-free market, anti-capitalistic. And that's, again, that top-down command and control structure in operation to try to keep things running smoothly. Then you have the possibility that you're going to have the oppression of workers. But if a guy's on his own and he's competing with other people, he's got to keep his people happy if he wants to keep them, otherwise they're going to leave. And so you will avoid a lot of these labor relations problems. And I think it's a well-known maxim that you inevitably have to fight for what you want. You have to struggle. Life, unfortunately, has a lot to do with strife, struggle, conflict. on that level. And this is the world we live in. This is the way the world is structured. And as long as we're going to live in this very physical place, and our mindset is going to be completely reliant on clawing your way to the top in an evolutionary sense, and the battle of wits or the survival of the fittest kind of situation, and you're operating on that level, then life is a constant struggle. Now, some people would say that, there is a way that life can be good, things can fall into place without struggle, just in a natural way. And I think that we more or less have to allow that to happen in our lives. It's possible. And I think the more we allow that to happen in our lives, then we can truly be successful in our lives. And it's not about struggle, it's about putting the priorities straight. And so we acknowledge the higher power. In Alcoholics Anonymous, that's what they do. They acknowledge the higher power. That's a step in the right direction. We can all do that. And it is helpful. If you try to pretend that it's only us and we're meat machines on a very physical universe with no other dimensional qualities, a very two-dimensional, simplistic worldview, then I think, that is the very difficult road that we have chosen to take. And, you end up in all kinds of struggles fighting for every scrap in order to stay alive. Why you would even want to live like that, I don't know. But some people, they don't understand that this is how they see the world, and this is the world that they live in. They create that reality for themselves. And one difficulty that we have to keep in mind, that we are going to face in life, is that if you don't acknowledge that the universe is magical and beyond our understanding, and that we need to allow ourselves to live in harmony with that unseen world, that unseen beauty, which is more like art. It can be only understood in relationship to sort of an artistic worldview, that there's a magical presence which can influence and tremendously powerful and is our most important purpose in being alive. We can be there. We can do that. That's important. And so we have to try to acknowledge, to accept, to appreciate, to feel gratitude, not necessarily because we're given physical pleasure or physical objects or a comfortable lifestyle, but just because we're alive. We are alive. That is the most wonderful blessing and gift that we could possibly have. And it's helpful to actually live in the world, to have that view. It makes it easier for us to deal with the physical problems that we have and acknowledge them. We don't have to hide from them so much. So it makes us more effective as human beings. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense at all, but it's, I think, useful to acknowledge in so many ways, to acknowledge that there is more going on in the universe than we read about in the economic books that we read in the history books, that we see on television, that we see in the movies. There's so much going on in the real world that we can enjoy and experience, not necessarily understand, because the human brain can only function on a certain level. The human brain is a tool, and it's a useful tool, and it helps us to survive. It regulates so much. It's very powerful, but it is limited in what it can actually do. Beyond the brain, there's so much more, though. Much of what goes on in ourselves, in our bodies, is not really measurable in a scientific view. If we were to be laid on a slab in the morgue and autopsied, consciousness would not be found. The seat of consciousness would not be found. And we would be, the scientists have been scratching their head about where is the seat of consciousness. People used to think it was in your brain. But I think there's so much more that's going on than just what your brain is doing. So we'll see how this all works out. I thought that the clip with Nigel Farage was very interesting. We'll see how Macron does in France. Very important for the future of the world to see how he does. So we'll be watching. That's all for today, and we'll see you very soon. Sleep well.